Hello, everybody. I am here with Anne Fullenkamp, the Senior Director of Creative Experiences at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. Anne, it's so great to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. It's good to see you too, Mark.
Anne, would you take a minute and give everybody your potted biography here? You've worn many hats. What has your journey been to this point in your career, specifically as a design leader at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh?
Sure. Happy to tell my story. It's very accidental. So I started my career intending to be a practicing architect. I have a bachelor's in fine arts from the Maryland Institute College of Art with the intent of going on and studying architecture, which I did. I went on to get my master's in architecture from Morgan State University in Baltimore. And then, even before then, I was always working. I was working in interior design firms, architecture firms, had a singular focus on the architecture world as my career. I was working really kind of getting to be a specialist in institutional housing. We did a lot of senior housing, apartments. I got to do a lot of fun market rate, adaptive reuse kind of things when I started my career in Baltimore and then moved to Pittsburgh. Yeah, so it was a pretty traditional path. And then one day I was in my office in Pittsburgh. This is around 2006. I had moved to Pittsburgh and was working at a wonderful firm, but something caught my eye. You know how you sit at a desk sometimes and look and see what jobs are out there. And something popped up for an exhibit designer. Had no idea what that was, but I actually applied for it more as a design exercise for myself. I we all have been this too in this situation where you go to work every day and you're in your routine. And I was feeling a little disconnected from that creative side. And frankly, I wasn't that far out of school. I've been working for about 6 or 7 years. So I didn't necessarily, I found my singular path yet, but in your work world, you start working. So that was happening really fast. So when I saw this, I was like, you know what? I'm going to apply because it required a portfolio, and it forced me, or it made me to kind of go back in and see if I could even get an interview, more of a lark. The job was blind. It was just for an exhibit designer. I didn't know that I was applying for a job at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. Frankly, if I had known that, I probably would not have applied for it. I thought I was applying for a museum because I thought also in my career as an architect, having some museum experience in my portfolio would open me up to other opportunities in architecture. The job was listed as a temporary position. So I was like, yeah, this could be a fun thing for a year and see if I could do it. So, anyway, long story short, I got the interview and it was actually interesting. I went in and it was for a temporary grant funded position. We had a really great discussion. I got really excited to hear what they were doing. And I walked back to my office in Pittsburgh. And by the time I got there, they had called me back and said if and asked if I could come back in the next day because one of their exhibit designers had resigned and there was another position available. We joked now that literally the former designer who I ended up replacing, he was waiting till they were finished my interview to come in and resign. So it was that quick. I came back the next day and we talked about a different position. And in the end, that's the position I took. It was also a temporary position, but it was to finish designing an exhibit that was already underway. It was had been 3 years of development, and they really needed someone with, actually my background was better suited to do project management, get the design drawings into construction drawings, and get the thing built. And for me, that was much less scary. The other position, to design exhibits from scratch, that was actually pretty scary and intimidating to me. So when I had the choice, I was like, oh yeah, I can do that. I can take these, get these into construction drawings and do the project management, get it to the end. So the position actually was offered as a 9 month position, which was shorter than the other one. But again, for me at the time, that's exactly what I wanted. It was kind of a break, almost like a sabbatical. Accepted that job. In the end, and I often say this, I drank the Kool-Aid. I came into an experience that I had no context for. I didn't even know that museums had exhibit designers. I didn't know this was a career path. I was immediately embraced by these wonderful people who were singularly focused on creating experiences for children. Really eclectic group, super talented. um, I happened to find the stars aligned in finding this role at the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh because it was really unique in that they were running a full design team within the Children's Museum. It's still very unique. Our executive director was a designer, our deputy director was a landscape architect. So they came in and they set up this design world because they really valued design as a way to creating meaningful experiences and respecting children. And the Children's Museum at the time had just reopened in 2004, was an architectural gem, really had won AIA awards. It was one of the first LEED certified. So design is part of the DNA at the Children's Museum. So I really found a home that felt very comfortable, but it was completely accidental.
Remarkable. And I have to say that I'm very proud to have spent many, many hours at the Children's Museum with my own children in Pittsburgh. And it is a spectacular place for sure. Well, thank you for giving me a little bit of your background. Now, as it pertains to our conversation today, you've also found yourself as a partner or consultant for many very interesting and innovative school districts, as far as I know, in the greater Pittsburgh region, but potentially beyond, that have really stepped outside the box and brought in some of the philosophical and some of the ideation that takes place at the Children's Museum into their own school modernization programs. Can you share a little bit about how you found yourself in those conversations and working on those types of projects? And it's notably, many of these are very highly regarded architecturally, but also educationally. Can you talk a little bit about how you found yourself doing that type of work?
Sure. Well, it's kind of that continuation because the Children's Museum, my temporary job got extended, and eventually I started working there. And part of that was to continue. We design and build everything in house, and we have an in house research and learning department, which is key. So, our museum, we consider it, and it is a laboratory where in this constant R&D where we're designing, prototyping, putting things out on the floor, presenting them, and then starting that process over and over again. Our work with schools really kind of came into focus around 2012, where, like I mentioned, the museum had gone through a major renovation in 2004. But one thing in the museum world, exhibits have pretty short lifespans because they're so heavily used. So after about 5 years, even the permanent exhibits, you have to start thinking about what's next. So around 2011, our team was focusing in on this phenomenon called maker and what that was. Maker fairs had started to pop up in San Francisco, and that kind of trend or this new idea of maker and maker fairs was popping up. So we were exploring that. And then we had also already been doing that in we called it a workshop where had real tools, materials out for kids. And our focus was on a design philosophy it still is called play with real stuff. So we had these activities about woodworking and simple circuits and sewing and really teaching these hands-on skills and in a very casual way. And that's the interesting thing about learning in a children's museum. We call it informal learning practices, which is play. It's which things, no expectations, no grades, just I'm curious, I'm going to mess around. So around 2012, the maker movement was really kind of becoming a thing. Our executive director became very involved with it, and we partnered with this national maker movement, and we ended up creating Make Shop. And that was a project that one of the first exhibit projects that I got to design fully in house. So we designed and built our Make Shop. And with that, we had established our learning and research team, and our first director of learning and research was getting her dissertation. She did her PhD on Make Shop. So that was a great opportunity too, because we built this together. Our Make Shop was part of that research work, and then we went on. We had a big grant with Google and created this making and learning framework on how to create informal learning environments. So that's how we kind of established ourselves with these relationships with schools, where we were showing the education world how you can create a space that supports informal learning, but in a way that could complement learning, the formal learning world in classrooms. So that's how we really got started. And then, kind of to your point, I was this itinerant architect, designer that had found this playland in the Children's Museum, was loving my career, and I would have conversations with my friends and colleagues in the architecture world. I started talking to some folks about what I was doing and this idea of informal learning and formal learning and how those two could merge. So I think that's where this really started.
You've said a lot there that is all worth circling back to, but I want to sort of put a pin in one thing you said and ask you to expand on it, if I may.
Sure.
We do hear regularly this idea that design supports pedagogy, right? But I actually think that you've done something where, in some senses, you've flipped that, right? To where you've actually shown that design can be, it doesn't just support, it can actually be a catalyst, right? It can transform. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that piece right there. How can space and design actually not just support existing pedagogy, but actually create a new terrain for kids to explore and teachers to explore?
Yeah, absolutely. I always say this. I'm a completely different designer, having worked at the Children's Museum, more because I can never get away from my client. Either, the museum, my boss is our client, but also the kids, the visitors are our clients every day. So good or bad, there's no hiding, running away from my mistakes. Or on the other hand, too, constantly I can also always fix things. I see how things are being used in real life. The museum educators, the staff, myself, my team, the visitors. It's like, okay, can we replace this? So I've had this opportunity to be in this laboratory setting constantly,
You're
all the
like the
time. So
architect who has to live in the school they design.
yes, literally, good and bad. But having said that, that's one of the things that I've really learned. It's opened my eyes to really understand, and it's made me a much more humble designer too. That sometimes I think that's one of my biggest takeaway is to make sure that the architecture, the FF&E, the furniture, fixtures, and equipment don't become a barrier to what the people in the space want to do in the moment. And I think that's from a informal, this idea of informal learning practices. And I think in schools it applies probably most directly is this idea of flexibility and responsive design. It's something, those terms are now kind of becoming common, which is exciting. But if we think about schools and what a traditional classroom is, where you had the rows of desks and you had the teacher's desk and you had the chalkboard, and everything is fixed, and that you're not supposed to mess around or move anything. Or if a teacher or somebody wanted to make a change, they have to call facilities, put in a work order. It becomes this whole process that in the moment, if a teacher and a student, something comes up, somebody asks a question, oh, that's interesting. You have 5 minutes at most. You're in the moment. You don't have time. It's like if the school base doesn't serve what's happening in the moment, you move on and you forget, and the bell rings and it's over. So that's where in a museum, the big piece that kind of has the from the design converge is that a museum, we are a museum, and people come and they pay. So there's expected value, and you want to see and be able to do things you can't do anywhere else, you can't do at home. And as a museum designer, we have a responsibility to curate and create a beautiful looking space. And the other thing too is when you come in to a space, whether it's our make shop or another exhibit, you're on your own. And at a children's museum, there's so many factors. There isn't a docent who's necessarily gonna. There might be a museum educator, but that experience, you're very independent in how you're going to approach or enter an exhibit and experience it for the first time. So when we were designing Make Shop, a lot of the decisions were about how the furniture, the materials, the look and feel can convey what you're supposed to do. So that's where, when we were deciding what kind of flooring, what to put on the walls, we wanted to create that feeling of a workshop, that feeling of like I can come in here, that good balance between mess and organization to make it feel accessible, but also to tell the story of what you're supposed to do here. And I think those are some of the elements that we're trying to bring into the school environment to give some more autonomy to the children and the teachers. So the design of the exhibit space is really about telling the story of what you can do here, the possibilities, the opportunities, the aspirational, and it needs, and a museum experience really needs to be inspiring. And so in our make shop, for example, we have projects everywhere. We have the tools, we have the materials just out to not only tell people what this space is about, what you're going to do here, but maybe inspire you to do something, because there'll be a museum educator will have activities planned, but you're not coming in with a teacher giving you the lesson. We want to encourage that independent exploration and really, inspire people to want to learn to how to sew, or what are these circuit blocks. So that kind of spirit is what, when we work with schools now, we try to capture that spirit, and have, how can a classroom be that inspiring. And I know one of the things that we would observe, and in casual conversations with my architecture friends, when I would talk about what we were doing in the children's museum compared to what was happening in the school environment, and what we were hearing from teachers, is that a school bus comes up for a field trip to the children's museum, and it's like you can literally see the bus shaking with excitement. The kids cannot wait. They can't wait to get off the bus, come into the museum on a field trip. They don't necessarily react that way when the school bus pulls up to school in the morning. So why are kids so excited to come into the museum, where in a space like Make Shop, for example, or even some of our other interactive spaces, they might be exploring and learning the same lessons, because the teachers come with learning goals and work with our museum educators, and the field trips are very focused and very content rich. But why are kids so excited to learn about math and circuitry or whatever they're learning about at the children's museum, and they don't have that same enthusiasm when they go into the classroom every day? And part of that is the setting, that freedom, that independence, that free exploration. And this is where also we can observe, and what we've seen from teachers, they're happier too, because they're put it more in a supportive role, coaching role, and they can have more freedom to be responsive, to answer the kids' questions, to see a kid who's curious about something who frankly was not curious about it in a classroom, and they get excited and inspired. So I think that's the overall spirit, how we can capture the enthusiasm, the joy of being in a museum, and bring some of that into the daily life of a school.
So much there to circle back to, but I want to take an off ramp into sort of where you just left off. I think every great designer and every great design firm and every school district who's really approaching the process of modernization or new construction the right way, they are getting input from various constituencies, right? And sometimes even students, right? But I think at the core of your approach is the centering of student experiences and young people as learners. I'm wondering if you could just expand a little bit upon how you bring student voice and young people as learners, their voices into the design process with your school clients specifically.
Yeah, so one of the things we've been able to do, we have a so lucky, I work with such talented people, but through our research and learning team, we've really developed an interesting process where we can go into schools, work with students, and really have them be co-designers and do design charrettes, but with the students as the main participants. I know as designers, we've all done design charrettes, and we bring in all the stakeholders and we do that. But we'll do this with an entire third grade with 100 kids, or we'll do it with a classroom, but where we put the kids through the whole iterative design process, but not in an abstract way or a pretend way. We're giving them the real design challenge. This is your classroom. What are the things that you want to be able to do? And frankly, and this is one of the reasons that I think I've been able to be successful at the Children's Museum, is I didn't have any early childhood experience coming in to working at the Children's Museum, because at the end of the day, children are people. And for the design process, it's new information for a lot of people. And children are humans and we have the same design aesthetics and needs as human beings. We want comfort. The principles of good design apply to all humans. And I think that idea, that sense of belonging, that this is their space, that they have agency is really key. And bringing them into the design process early and letting them know that the adults in their life are doing this for them and care about them makes a big difference. But it's this sense of respect and agency. So what we do is we have many ways we do this, but it's they come in, they can draw, they can use objects. Depending on the specifics of the school, it might be a very specific, like you're getting this new playground, you're getting this new classroom. What do you want in it? We work with the teachers in the schools pretty closely to set up the design challenge for each school. But at the end of the day, it's really about the students using all kinds of ways to communicate what they need in their school, what they need for them personally. I think that's another big factor is letting the students know that it really is about their personal learning experience too, and having that free choice. I think that's one of the biggest differences, that they really have choice. And a big factor that we go into all of the design shreds, even when we're working with the adult stakeholders, we start with how it's going to look and feel. How does your school day look and feel, rather than how many seats do you need? It was all about the experience and what are you going to do and what do you want to do? And I think if that's where we center it, it's, this is a place where, we all, the teachers and the students, they spend a big part of their day and their lives. So, when you come into the space, what do you have to do? What do you want to do? And how do you feel when you're there?
I love how you just described the moment of framing where you talk about what do you do and what do you want to be able to do. I think this is the greatest designers that I've been fortunate enough to be around shine a light into what's possible,
Right.
and I think it's hard to do within institutional education. It's very difficult. The realities of school life and district life, the dynamics, there are real challenges institutionally. And so, the existence and the proximity to great designers, I think, is such an important part of the guiding process. I actually digging a little bit deeper onto that. I mean, sometimes there is a large disconnect between, you know, the language, the perspective, the vision of the design firm or the designers who are sort of helping guide the district and the actual practical realities on the ground. What are some of the trade-offs or tensions or challenges that you've navigated with your clients, whether it's budgetary, whether it's personnel, whether it's programmatic, whether there are other contextual factors that create hurdles? What are some of the things that you've learned or experienced in those situations?
Yeah, I think, that's an excellent point. I think the first barrier that I experience when working with a district who's not familiar with us, it's they hear that a museum, they hear that somebody's bringing in a museum to design the school. They immediately think that it's going to be hugely expensive. Oh, we can't afford that. So that's the first thing that I try to dispel. It's that I'm actually trying to do the opposite. Yes, we're a museum, but we're a nonprofit children's museum. We are not the Met. Like art museums, we are poor. We are living the life of the teacher in the classroom. We understand budgets. We are, repurpose things. So that's the first piece that I try to set a level set, is that, and that goes to, when I was talking before about being my own client, I'm also my facilities, team, and the operations and the day-to-day care of the facility is also on our plate too. So I see that. So that's the first thing that I think we try to do is, if anything, from our perspective at the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh, we're trying to show how you can save money, or my favorite phrase is get the most bang for your buck. Take the money you have and put it where it makes the most sense. Because there's some things when you're dealing with children that are going to have to be replaced regularly. And then there are other things that can last generations. And that's kind of a bigger idea, getting back to the facility and getting into this idea of getting institutional buy-in. When a community designs a museum, it's for generations, a lifetime. Museums are 100 years old. The Children's Museum of Pittsburgh is young. We're 43 years old, and that's still a young museum. But communities build museums for generations. Schools are no longer built that way. And that is becoming a problem in the country because it's unsustainable if schools need to be updated every, if they're getting outmoded. It's a huge burden on communities. But how we can think about the school building lasting 50, like what we're doing today, but what is it going to be in 20 years, in 30 years, in 50 years? And can we build, especially if it's a new build, can we build in a system so that every semester it can be updated, every year it can be updated, every 5 years, every 10 years, every 20 years, and think more in a facilities management way like a museum does. So that's the big factor, and that gets into budget. So that's usually the first barrier is budget.
You just actually astonished me by saying that the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh is 43 years old. Yet I've been in there fairly recently. It's vibrant, it's alive, it's obviously modern. It's very much an ecosystem for exploration. But if you go into a school building, most places that's 43 years old, you're very unlikely to describe it in those terms. So I just
Right.
think like, job well done in, for that organization to really keep students, evolution, exploration, iteration at the center of like the institutional culture. I do think it's worth, celebrating that for a moment, as you were saying.
Well, but thank you. And that goes to the core of some of our design consulting work. It's how you can build this so it can function more like a museum, in that we have galleries that have to change out frequently. Some spaces change out daily, like our make shop and art studio. That's very responsive. That functions more like a classroom where there are different things happening every day. But then there are art exhibitions that are up for a month, 3 months, a year. Then there are exhibits, are permanent exhibits that are 10 years old. But how, frankly, as a business, how we can entice people and make it feel fresh every time they come. So that's how we think about the facility walls and the furniture and all the stuff in there. So that the designer in my role, in my team's role, we're not going to be in an exhibit necessarily every day changing things around, but how we could work with our museum educators and our floor staff so they can make small changes, do programs, do things so it feels fresh, work with our art curators so they can change out the artwork and kind of build that layered system so that someone in my role, I'm working on some capital projects that the visitors will see in 2 and 3 years. But then on any given day, our studio arts manager has transformed the art studio so it feels completely different than it did last weekend. So that kind of thinking from a facilities management point of view is what we try to bring in the consulting role. And sometimes it's classroom by classroom. When we do get to work on a capital project and are brought in, that's kind of the advice. We want to work in tandem as part of a team with the architects, with the interior designers, with the furniture reps. I'm kind of like I'm the reality check, the dream crusher, because the other piece of it is I can say, oh, you know what? In a year, that whiteboard, I don't think anyone's on the whiteboard will fault me on this. The whiteboard will need to be replaced. It's really hard to get those blue shadow lines off. But what if we make the whiteboard replaceable, put something on the wall so facilities can quickly change that out without having to put in a work order and build it in. So there's certain items like that just from frankly, my war stories and my experience of having to replace things and made my mistakes. So those are kind of the things. But I think getting back to your question, budget is usually the first barrier, and looking at how we understand the year to year operations, the operations budgets, and how we can look at that and try to help everyone make the most out of the money they have. And then the other piece is I always love to work really closely with the facilities managers, the teams and the operations teams of the school, because even the best well-intended architects and designers and everything, they're going to move on. There's that punch list turnover, and then it becomes the facilities manager's job to really take care of the school and have this work beyond opening the first day of school. And sometimes, because of their limits, their budgets, and their daily operation needs, they'll make different design decisions that work for them. So that's the other piece, is if we can get buy-in and cooperation from the operations team, really understand what they're dealing with and build that in to the whole model of the school, and that make them feel, because they are a huge part of the school life and making the design work, if they can be a part of it. So even if it's something as simple as what kind of flooring they like, the corners, how they're going to deal with corners, that's always a big issue, the walls, all of that kind of stuff. That's a big factor, I think, that I found that most people don't think about. And going back to my life when I worked in architecture firms, the end user, bringing them in at the commissioning and the punch list, and at the end, if we can bring the facilities people in from the beginning and make them feel like a partner with the teacher, because that's who, at the end of the day, it's the teacher talking to the facilities guy and asking for a new whiteboard in year 3 after the construction. Those are the people who will be making the design decisions for the school.
And it's so interesting. I mean, you are in this position of having one foot in the museum and the design world, and the other foot in the educational world. And the Children's Museum gives you this vantage point on really values like curiosity and play and agency and imagination and belonging.
When we work with schools at K 12, it's not just about furniture or design, it's about impact. Our radically student centered approach puts students at the center of every decision. From that first conversation to the final walkthrough, we're focused on creating spaces that actually work for the kids, the teachers, and the community. So if you're looking to do more than just check a box on your next project, let's talk. Visit K12.com. That's KAY TWELVE.com and see how we're helping schools transform learning one student at a time. Because at K 12, it's not just about projects and furniture, it's about purpose.
When you look out on education as a space of practice, do you think the trend lines are moving in the right direction with respect to those types of values? I mean, do you think that more educational schools or districts or educational entities are really taking on those values? I mean, do you feel like the future is bright with respect to values alignment?
I do. I do think also, there's this focus on an understanding that not all students are the same, that everyone has different learning styles. And if we can accommodate and be more responsive to different kids' learning styles, that everyone will thrive. I mean, that has been something that's really powerful. And we're seeing a lot of great things. And even this reintroduction of late to hands-on learning, that not everything has to be on a screen and a computer. That one thing that, we talk about maker and the maker movement as being this innovative new thing, but in all candor, anyone over a certain age remembers shop class, home ec. When that went away, I think we now see that we lost a lot of kids that really thrived in those kinds of learning environments. And all the other thing too, it seems common sense, all the things we learned, even the STEM things we learned by sewing. And I think that's what's kind of exciting, seeing the hands-on making coming back side by side with the more traditional learning, math, science, literacy. I see there's a lot of stress now because everyone is doing such a great job understanding the different learning styles. I think teachers are feeling very stressed to have so many personalized learning, and or feeling just stretched thin, having to do too much for too many students in a highly specialized way. and not feeling like they have the capacity to do that. And that's where I do think design can be a factor, because there are ways to set up a classroom and even a school building that can create some better, simple things like sight lines, so you can feel comfortable letting the one kid who needs to stand to do that without being disruptive to everyone else, or have a small group of kids go out in the hallway who might be, able to work on a project together really successfully while the other kids are working more quietly one on one. So that's where I do think the school design and thinking about the classroom differently and the hallways differently and the spaces. One thing I like to say, it's the spaces in between the classrooms are also places for curiosity, learning. And for schools, it's a big footprint. You're paying to heat the hallways, and all the places in between the formal learning spaces are also part of the school that the school's investing in and paying for. Why not use those spaces too? And the kids can do that. And if you can kind of start thinking about, you said ecosystem, but think about the whole building as part of your learning day, that could relieve some of the tension and the stress on the teachers. And that's the other big factor when we think about school more designed more like a museum. In a museum, we use every inch to tell our story. Every wall gets a piece of art at the Children's Museum. The floors are considered as part of our wayfinding experiences, signage, direction, because our visitors come in on their own. So we have to provide all these cues, and we use every inch, lighting in the ceilings, all of it. So I think that's a big part of, reimagining this idea of a new learning style, being more inclusive, the feeling of belonging, letting kids kind of do what they need to do in a given day, in a moment, so they can still stay within the school day, into the routine. Everyone can thrive, and really take some of that pressure off of the teachers, to feel like they have too much to do. I think that's part of the still an ongoing challenge.
You've worked with many schools, many educational leaders. I mean, these are passionate, committed people, right? And at varying degrees of district leadership or school leadership. What is something that you reliably see people getting wrong about how kids experience space and how kids learn?
Just from a design standpoint, this idea that windows are distracting, access to natural light, being able to see outside, I think is so important. Making the inside feel like a place you want to be, not institutional, not oppressive. Having natural light is really important. Artificial lighting has gotten so much better. I mean, we're so far beyond the fluorescence and that kind of flickering lighting, but lighting is a huge factor. And I think it's allowing for dimness and change of light, and that going back to nature and how light changes throughout the day as the sun moves and as clouds come and go, and having that change um, inside should reflect that too, because that's how our bodies function. We're used to following the sun and seasons changing. And so our brains and our biology is tuned in to understand that. And I think that's a big factor when you're in a building and the lighting is the same and flat all day, year round. But that's kind of cool too, as designers, because LED lights are so affordable now and the technology of lighting has gotten so sophisticated and the prices have come down. I think that's a huge opportunity to do really remarkable things that will serve the comfort and learning. So that's one factor. And I think the other is this, going back to the senses, surfaces, all hard surfaces. I get the durability of that, but when everything is tile, that creates one note. And getting back to the life of a school and all of the people and the monotony every day, you're in this school 9 months out of the year, 8 hours a day sometimes, and it's not just the students, it's the teachers. imagine if your world, if you set up your house where all the surfaces were like your bathroom. Imagine your entire house being fit out and finished like your bathroom. I mean, that would drive you crazy. So I think that variety of texture, but you can still, and this is where the technology of materials have gotten much more sophisticated. You have these great laminated floors, but they have a little warmth and they have a little cushion, all of that kind of stuff. So I think the variety of material and just staying in tune with who we are as beings and connecting with the senses, that yes, durability and maintenance is paramount, but recognizing that kids are tuned into all of those comforts too. It's not just like when as adults we get to design our houses, or you can go to a different work environment and choose your a lot of people today now in the current work environment, you can choose to work at home. You can choose a work environment, an office, based on what amenities they have. Since we're talking about it, when we look at how colleges are designed and how college spaces and all the amenities of colleges are using that as a competitive edge to decide where you're going to go and study. The quality of the university centers, the quality, how these things are going to look and feel. They've become architectural landmarks, and using the architecture as incentives to choose this school to study. Why aren't we doing that in K through 12, or even actually elementary school? It's being, you can see that now in high schools. It's kind of been in reverse. You see that kind of design aesthetic in high schools now around the country, but not necessarily in elementary schools. You see it sometimes in pre-K and kindergarten, but then there's this kind of gap. And I think that's where we think about it like full circle design aesthetics and comfort, temperature, lighting, sound. I think that's the other thing, the acoustics. And that goes back to hard surfaces. So it all plays together.
I might ask you to expand on this point a little bit further, because in my travels and my close collaboration with both design firms and school districts myself, it seems to me that one of the main foundational points in all of these conversations that schools misunderstand is movement. And there's
Absolutely.
a general aversion to too much movement. And I'm wondering if, and you've seen this as well, I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about, your perspective on how movement is integral to, all the positive and pro-social things that we care about with respect to both development and learning, and all the other, aspects.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I mean, actually, when we design an exhibit, we have this kind of checklist of the way we approach our exhibit design at the museum is we try to have a balance of various elements. And one is having gross motor and fine motor skill within the same space. Because at any given time, a child needs to move, the gross motor play, and then in that same space, and maybe 5 minutes later, they'll want to do something that's a fine motor skill, or a sit and a quiet and read a book. And we see that in the museum. It's remarkable where you'll see a kid running around in circles, and then a minute later, they've sat down and they've got a book in their lap. And I think that is key to being able, especially when they're younger, to acknowledge that you need that gross motor play, you need that ability to move. And I mean, granted, in a classroom, the understanding that you can't be disruptive, but again, that the teachers and the educators, there's and I'm far not an educator, but there are developmental stages of childhood, and as you get older, you're better able to regulate and balance the gross motor, fine motor, and your impulse control. But certainly, the younger the kids, the impulse control and the needing to get up and get the wiggles out, and having that balance. But it continues through life, like adults. Again, I
It's
keep going back to
physiology. Yeah.
physiology. Thinking back to ourselves when we're sitting stuck on Zoom calls for 6 hours. I mean, we feel terrible. It's physically exhausting, even though we haven't moved. How, you want to get up, take a walking break. Children are the same way. So that's where thinking about the spaces in between, what that hallway experience can be in a positive way, having sitting and standing chairs, things like that, but also thinking about recess in a way, how the building inside can be used for recess. I know we've had a lot of fun at our museum. We have something we call the limb bender, which is an ant farm looking thing. That's a wall. So basically, it's this series of platforms that is a, a wall that is our a grand on our grand stair. It's the wall for the grand stair, but it's only 2 feet wide, but it's a 20-foot tall vertical climbing structure. It takes up no space. Kids often come in, go through that as part of their pathway to the museum. Ramps, stairs, getting kids thinking about those experiences. Something as simple as moving from one space to the other can check that box and then have the kids ready. So I think that's an excellent point, that it's in addition to the playground, it can just be that movement between classrooms that could be that added need to fill the gross motor and fine motor skill balance.
It is really compelling, the research on physiology and movement, and as you were saying, even movement that's relatively imperceptible is just important for young learners to have, and for even us as well. All right, well, so I'm gonna ask for just a few final words of wisdom, if I may, to our friends, superintendents, business managers, directors of curriculum and instruction, school principals, folks who are really living the life on the district side, who are dabbling with or exploring or maybe even beginning the journey of school transformation, right? They're beginning this journey, and we know it can take years. It is a year long, multiple year long process to successfully see one of these projects come to fruition. Unbelievable amount of work and dedication. What final words of wisdom would you offer to any of our friends in our audience who maybe find themselves sitting in that seat, who may be exploring the possibility of this future for them?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is, don't think you need a lot of money to get started. We use the phrase a small bet. Everything we've done at the museum that's turned out to be really successful has started out with a small experiment, an idea, a tabletop idea, rearranging the furniture. Our whole make shop project that was a movement turned into this movement, started with a corner with a table with some blocks on it. So I think that's the first thing, is to get into that experimental mode. Your educators, your places for learning, you have laboratories. Take a corner of your library, take an underused classroom, experiment, set that up. And that way, before you invest huge amount of dollars, change systems, do anything, see how it goes first and make these small bets. And then just treat it like an experiment, do these small proof of concepts. And then as a part of that, you can get the community buy-in, institutional buy-in, see which teachers might come and say, hey, I'm really interested in this, and really kind of build that culture from within first before you make these wholesale changes.
Well, Anne, it's been an absolute pleasure to spend an hour with you, and I want to thank you for giving us your time, your insight, and wish you all the best as you continue doing incredible work and making a huge impact in the greater Pittsburgh region and beyond. So thank you so much for giving us your time this morning.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I know we'll see each other again soon.
Yes, we will. All right, be well.
The Better Learning Podcast is produced by Matt Rogers and edited by Callie Jones. The views and opinions shared on this podcast are those of the individual speaking and do not necessarily represent the perspectives of their affiliated companies, organizations, or associations.